Good afternoon, everyone. I am thrilled to have so many of you joining us this afternoon for what I know is going to be a rich conversation about monitoring outcomes and measuring impact, and learning the lessons from our friends to the south and the work of the Opportunity Youth Forum. And as we get underway, I do want to start by acknowledging that all of us are meeting today on traditional lands of First Nations and Indigenous peoples, and as part of Canada's commitment to our truth and reconciliation process, we want to take a moment to recognize the importance of this kind of land recognition as one small way of honoring and demonstrating respect for the diverse histories and cultures of all First Nations people. And I personally am joining you today from Caledon, Ontario, which is the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation and home to Anishinaabeg, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Métis peoples. And I would encourage each of you to take a moment and ground yourselves and honor the Indigenous lands on which you find yourself. And if you know which lands those are, I'd invite you to share that in the chat box, because I'm excited to know that we have so many people joining us from, frankly, all around the world. Over to you, Duncan.
Thanks, Sylvia. Just as we all share the land we're joining from, I just wanted to take a moment and provide some details on technical assistance. Today's webinar is being live interpreted, so if you would prefer to hear the French audio, you can use the translation button at the bottom of your Zoom client to do so. A few other announcements. We do invite you to submit questions for our speakers using the Q&A panel at the bottom of your Zoom client. If you don't have a question, you can still get involved. You can use the thumbs up feature to vote on which questions you'd like to see answered. And if you have any technical difficulties throughout the call, feel free to reach out using the chat function, and I'll be there to assist you. Thanks, Sylvia.
Beautiful. Thanks. So now it is my absolute pleasure to introduce the three speakers on our panel today. First, joining me is Monique Miles, who is the director of the Opportunity Youth Forum and the deputy director of the Forum for Community Solutions. Prior to joining the Aspen Institute Forum on Community Solutions, Monique was the director post-secondary achievement at the National Youth Employment Coalition. And in her role there, she oversaw the Post-Secondary Success Initiative, a national pilot that supported community-based organizations across America to design and implement post-secondary programming in partnership with local institutions of higher learning for students who were disconnected from education. Also joining us on the panel this afternoon is Justin Piff. Justin is the Vice President of Learning and Impact at Equal Measure, where he leads evaluations of several multi-site systems change initiatives that are focused on improving outcomes across the cradle to career continuum. His current and recent work includes evaluations of the Aspen Institute's Forum for Community Solutions Opportunity Youth Forum, Lumina Foundation's Talent Hubs initiative, and Strive Together's Cradle to Career Network. And also joining us today, we have Kathy Hamilton, who serves as the Youth Transitions Director at the Boston Private Industry Council, which is part of Boston's Workforce Development Board. In her role, she supports the development of education and career pathways for young adults. She has organized Boston's Youth Transition Task Force over the last 15 years, which focuses on reducing Boston's dropout rate, and she co-convenes Boston's Opportunity Youth Collaborative that is focused on ending youth disconnection and advancing racial equity. She partners closely with education and workforce institutions to craft new approaches and remove long-standing barriers for low-income youth of color. She leads the Private Industry Council Success Boston post-secondary coaching for first-generation college students and is an active member of national networks, including Aspen's Opportunity Youth Forum. And I, Sylvia Chu, Consulting Director of Collective Impact at Tamarack's Learning Center, am going to be sort of the host and moderator for our conversation. But as Duncan mentioned, we will be welcoming comments and questions, so feel free to type those into the Q&A box and or into the chat box, and we will incorporate them into the dialogue. All right. Well, maybe as a nice way to kind of ease in and let each one of you kind of meet our panel, I wonder if I could call on each of you to share a little bit about what inspires you most about the work that you're currently involved in. And let's start with Monique. Monique, what is inspiring to you about your work?
Thank you so much, Sylvia, for your question. Thank you to you and all of our partners at Tamarack Institute. It's such an honor and privilege to be here with you all today. And I just want to say thank you to everyone who's joining us from around the globe. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're calling in from. What inspires me most about my work? I've spent some time thinking about this, and I'm so glad that this is where Sylvia started our conversation today. What I will say is that we've been doing this work, co-leading the Opportunity Youth Forum and Fund at the Aspen Institute now since 2012. So we've been doing this for 9 years. At the onset of our work, we said that our work here in the United States would be deeply committed to racial equity and racial justice. So you'll hear us unpack a lot of our work before you today, how we've thought about outcomes and measurements. At the core of our work, we are deeply committed to both systems change and metric impact. Our way into achieving system change and metric impact is through thinking about racial equity and racial justice and what it means to dismantle systems of oppression that have locked Black, BIPOC, Latinx students and youth and young adults out of opportunity for generations. So what inspires me most is really thinking about how to foster meaningful change, meaningful belonging for our country's most vulnerable youth and young adults so that their aspirations and vision for a more just and equitable, inclusive community and world are able to come to the fore. Thank you. And you're on mute, Sylvia.
That is so beautiful. My heart is full, Monique. Thank you for that and grounding the deeper purpose of this work. How about you, Justin? What inspires you most in the work you're doing?
Thanks so much, Sylvia. And I also really appreciate this question. I am deeply driven by a commitment to justice and equity, and I'm a social worker by training, and really see it as an honor and a privilege to facilitate the work that decision makers and activists and those on the ground and those in our communities are doing. And really a privilege to provide data and insights that enable them to do that work even better than they're already doing it. So I appreciate and value the opportunity for folks to take some time to reflect and learn on the work that's going on the ground, and then creating the space for them to take their work to the next level through data and additional insights.
Wow, talk about a lovely marriage of head and heart, huh? And how about you, Kathy? What inspires you most in this work?
I think, I feel a lot of what Monique and Justin feel. And I think at the local level, though, it's seeing the young people whose the odds are stacked against them because of that institutional racism in our system. And when I see them reach their milestones and achieve their goals, we had a young lady who's an opportunity youth, an immigrant, who really wanted to be a nurse. And even like advantaged competitive students have a hard time getting into nursing programs. And she had failed the entrance exam, but our coach worked with her. She passed the entrance exam and got into nursing school, which, just kind of chokes me up a little bit. And one of our early dropouts who we re-engaged has gone to college at Brandeis and now is a dean at a charter school. And he wants to become superintendent and change the school so that he doesn't have to repeat what he went through. We don't have to. So that's what inspires me.
Wow. You know what? Together, your comments have really kind of illustrated what for me is most exciting about the conversation we're having, because it really kind of speaks to how important the local is, and yet also how those local individual stories are contributing to a greater national narrative. And that's kind of what I'm really eager to explore with all of you today. So maybe we can start with you, Monique. Tell us more about, for those on the call who may not know, the work of the Opportunity Youth Network, and in particular, how you use data, outcomes, and impact, both to assess, guide, and communicate about your work, both at the local level, but then also that national story.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I'm going to ask Duncan to go ahead and forward the slide. There we go. So everyone knows probably who Opportunity Youth are. So I'm going to move through this really quickly in order to really answer Sylvia's question about how we use data to promote outcomes and advanced learning. I'll just say for you all, because, you know, like many places around the world, the United States is still reeling from the impacts of COVID. And as you all may imagine, COVID has disproportionately impacted not just communities of color, but our most vulnerable youth and young adults. So I wanted to just kick this off by doing some level setting, because when we first started this work 9 years ago, there were about 5.8 million youth and young adults out of school and out of work, which is how we define opportunity youth, 16 to 24-year-olds who are out of school and out of work. Over the last 8 years or so, that number had been reduced by almost 1 million, thanks to the local efforts in communities around the US, in addition to Sylvia's point, aggregating those efforts at the national level. In 2020, again, as I noted, the numbers had been reduced by almost 1 million, but since COVID has hit, we are anticipating that the numbers have more than doubled. So we are thinking that there are approximately now 8 to 9 million youth and young adults across the United States who are out of school and out of work. And it's important to set that context for you all, so that as I talk about data, outcomes, how we're thinking about impact, you just have a sense of just nationally what the numbers look like. Next slide. Thank you. So in the US, again, just to ground you all and just nationally who our youth and young adults are, our opportunity youth, they're nearly twice as likely to live in poverty. They're 3 times more likely to have a disability of some kind, which by the way has gone undiagnosed, likely by the school systems and the many systems that are meant to serve them. They're 9 times more likely to have dropped out of high school. They're more than 20 times as likely to be living in an institutionalized group setting. And it's really important to note that here in the United States, disconnected young women are 4 times as likely to be mothers as their connected peers. So again, just trying to paint a picture, create some texture of who young people who are opportunity youth are in the United States. Next slide, please. In terms of race and ethnicity, again, just wanted to give you a national picture. Native American youth have a disconnection rate of 23%. That's the highest of any group in the United States. Black teens follow that with a disconnection rate of 17.4%. Next are Latino youth, who are disconnected at 12.8%, followed by white youth and young adults at 9.2%. And then finally, Asian youth at 6.2%. What does this slide tell us? This slide tells us that my comments earlier about centering racial equity and racial justice in our efforts to meaningfully disrupt the barriers to opportunity for youth and young adults in the United States, it requires us to hold a racial equity lens. Because when we look at the policies that have disproportionately impacted opportunity, they have been racially based. And as you can see, based on the national numbers, have historically locked BIPOC and Latinx students out of opportunity. So what's the challenge before us? The challenge before us is that we have many, many systems that are meant to serve our young people, not just equitably in terms of what their needs are, but really get them onto a pathway to successfully transition into adulthood. However, in the US, what it actually looks like is the many systems meant to support our young people are disconnected, right? Justice system, the philanthropic sector, education system, child welfare system. And as I noted, these systems are meant to come together to meaningfully support young people. We say in the US all the time, it's not our young people who are disconnected, it's the systems. So if you look to the right, the vision of the work that we are supporting in communities around the United States is that all of these systems would come together and really be aligned across systems and across sectors with youth at the center and everything that young people need to successfully transition into adulthood, that those systems would interconnect to be able to bolster outcomes for youth and young adults. Next slide, please. So now that you have some understanding of the national landscape, and you also have a sense of what our vision of meaningfully supporting youth and young adults at the local level looks like, I wanted to tell you just a tiny bit about our network. So again, we launched the Opportunity Youth Forum and Fund in 2012. To date, we now currently support almost 40 rural, urban, and tribal communities in the United States to bring cross-system and cross-sector partners together to improve education and career outcomes for youth and young adults. Across our national network in the United States, we know that our network is home to 3.4 million opportunity youth. So I talked about that number ballooning to almost 9 million youth and young adults. We know that our network right now touches approximately 3.4 of those youth and young adults. 12% are disconnected from work and school. We know that across our network, the high school, that secondary completion, or excuse me, I should say the secondary disconnection rate is 14%. Post-secondary disconnection rate is 21%, and the workforce disconnection rate is 11%. And I'll say more about this in a moment, but those are the metric impact numbers that we track across our national network in order to improve outcomes. So I'm going to finally get to Sylvia's question in a moment, but I would be remiss if I didn't take a second to unpack for you all, what do we measure? So our entire conversation here today is about measurement, but most importantly, impact and how impact fosters learning for us. For us, nationally, we think about it in two ways. First and foremost, how does the data inform strategy? How are we collecting data and feeding that data back to our community grantee partners so that they're able to strategically look at their efforts, everything from the partners and the infrastructure and capacity that they have to collaborate for impact, to what are the pathways that we have on the ground in communities to promote better outcomes for youth and young adults, the different pockets of data, secondary data, post-secondary data, workforce data, community-wide disconnection rate, that we are feeding them that level of information. The fourth piece of data for our communities is, what does this tell us about the systems that need to change and the policies, the barriers that function to disrupt opportunity? And then the next piece for our communities in terms of unpacking the data to inform learning is also around the ability to either sustain the work. So what type of private dollars do we have investing in our work, and what type of public dollars are we leveraging to improve outcomes? And then we also support communities to think strategically about a policy and advocacy agenda that can lead to better public investments and better private investments. I mentioned a commitment to racial equity. I'd be remiss if I didn't continue to come back to that, because that's also part of the data that we ask communities to look at. And then the last piece for us is youth-led change, centering youth voice and the experiences of young people at the center of how communities are thinking about strategy. That's why I loved Kathy opening us up with a youth story, because if we're missing anything in this conversation today, it's youth voice and youth perspective. And so we want to always meaningfully integrate that into any conversations we're having about youth and young adults and the work that we do here at the Aspen Institute. So those areas that I just walked through, all of that data is data that we share with our communities to not just support strategy, but also continuous learning, so that not only strategy is always evolving, but communities are always meaningfully able to think about, where have we seen progress? Where are the gaps, and how do we continuously improve? So what I want to say is that, just go back, Duncan, sorry. I wanted to just at a high level walk you through our theory of change, because this really reflects all of the data that we collect and support our communities to share, so that we can feed this information back to them in order to inform strategy and continuous learning and improvement. So first and foremost, we are collecting data in terms of being a high capacity local OY collaborative. I won't walk through the bullets that you see before you, but you can just get a sense here of what are some of those elements that support collaboratives to be high functioning, to achieve impact, leadership, community power building, setting goals and measuring them over time. So that's one piece of the work that we support communities to do. The second piece is improving system change. We're deeply committed to system level outcomes. I talked about public and private funding, quality improvement, public will building, narrative change. All of that is how we think about supporting system level outcomes. And then the third piece of the pie that you see before you is high quality local programming. So not just serving more opportunity youth, but how you improve outcomes over time. And the cross-cutting areas that we collect data on and feedback data on, again, racial equity, youth-led change, and community power building. And it is our belief, by collecting data in each of these domains, that ultimately what we're supporting communities to achieve locally is fewer disconnected youth. So that overall disconnection rate, community-wide disconnection rate will be reduced. That includes secondary completion rates improving, post-secondary completion rates improving, and greater, more meaningful connections to careers and workforce. That is our vision and our theory of change. And that's all the data that we collect and feedback locally and then aggregate nationally in order to look at, and here's the final slide, and this is the final answer, in order to inform how we work with our national learning and technical assistant partners. We're so honored today to have Equal Measure here with us. They've been with us since the very beginning, and they help us year after year through our evaluation, collect this type of data, analyze this type of data, and we use this to guide everything from our learning agenda and the learning series that we roll out, to our communities of practice that we convene, to the convenings that we design, where we do very targeted TA across many of the areas I walked through already today. We also partner with Measure of America, which helps us on the data side, understanding data and translating that into technical assistance. And we work with Standpoint Consulting on results-based accountability. Our assessments include an annual self-assessment and outcomes reporting. And as I said many times, this data is not only collected locally, but we aggregate it nationally to highlight gaps, know areas of progress. And for us, it also helps us pull back the aperture. So we're not only thinking network-wide, we're also looking across the broader movement. And at the movement level, we are assessing where are the trends, where does the field need to go, where are those gaps, and how can we continue to use this network to fill those gaps. And communicating outcomes, we do that in a range of ways: our webinars, white papers, tools, convenings, but also for us, it's about aligning with other networks and movements to focus very specifically on not just narrative change, but centering the voice, the lived experience, the aspiration and vision of the youth and young adults that we serve. I know that that was a lot, but I just wanted to give you a sense of this because we roll up our sleeves and we take this work to heart daily. And we're so honored to work with partners like Equal Measure and Kathy from Boston in order to move this work forward. Thank you, Sylvia.
Wow, Monique, that's really impressive, both in terms of the clarity around the data that you are tracking regularly over time, but also how you are very mindful of the distinct and supportive audiences, right, that rely on what you're pulling together to guide their own work and inspire their own work and feed continuous learning through the system. Wow. So Justin, I want to call on you now to really help us unpack and understand a bit more in terms of, what does that process look like around evaluation, both at the local and national level, from sort of, a bit of a technical expert. What kind of work does this involve? And as importantly, we've seen 9 years, the outcome of 9 years of work. And so how have you seen that evolve over time? And, where do you see it kind of needing to focus next? There's a juicy 3-part question for you.
Yeah, and I'll do my best to answer that. So certainly for context, Equal Measure conducted a 3-year evaluation of the OIF network from 2015 through 2017. We took a pause to do some data-focused work, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. And then we relaunched another 3-year evaluation in 2019. And so we're nearly halfway through this second evaluation of the entire network, which of course, as Monique's mentioned, has really grown and expanded over the period of time. So Monique captured, of course, the theory of change really, really well. And our approach to data collection and evaluation follows that theory of change. So we have a 3-pronged focus for the evaluation. We focus on understanding and measuring collaborative capacity, so the infrastructure and the tools to do the work on the ground and in communities. We are focused on measuring systems change, right? Because it's the systems that are broken and that are causing youth to be disconnected. So we really feel, and this is just such an important part of this theory of change, that it's the systems that need to be fixed, and it's the systems that need to be woven together and be positioned to better support all youth. And then lastly, that 3rd prong is, of course, opportunity youth. And Monique mentioned the notion of metric impact. So our evaluation overall is focused on looking at changes and progress in those 3 areas. So I'm sure a lot of folks are wondering, well, how do you do that? So the primary data collection tool we use is an annual self-assessment. And we ask communities to rate themselves on a number of indicators associated with collaborative capacity and systems change. In total, that's about 130 indicators. And we also ask them to report aggregate opportunity youth and general population youth data to us as well as part of that annual reporting process. Of course, we analyze that data. We analyze it at the network, at the aggregate level, each year and over time. And we're also very interested in understanding the patterns within that network data, right? So understanding to what extent backbone characteristics are associated with progress in those areas, to what extent the size of a community, the maturity of a community, the data capacity of a community might be affecting those changes. So we slice and dice those data in a number of ways to better understand, right, and ultimately better inform strategic decisions for the network around what it takes to move the needle on systems change and, again, ultimately opportunity youth outcomes. And Monique mentioned sharing data with the sites and having them involved in the process. And that's a really critical important of how we approach all of our work. So each year we do provide obviously a big annual report that aggregates all of that information up, but we also provide customized reports to each of the communities participating in the evaluation. So they are able to use that data to reflect on it, to strategize, and also to compare it, I should say contextualize their data and benchmark their data against the entire network as well as a subset of peer communities. So we really encourage folks to reflect on the data that they've shared with us and use that to inform their work moving forward. Lastly, I'll mention that qualitative data is also a very important part of our process. We talk to the site leads at least annually. We conduct site visits, we review products, grant reports, et cetera, shared by the communities to give us a much more nuanced understanding of the work that's happening within communities. We just can't get that through that quantified data, no matter how strong our data collection tools are. Understanding the nuance of the work, the success, the challenges, the contextual factors affecting the work is really a very critically important aspect of our evaluation as well.
Wow, Justin, you've just done such a beautiful job of kind of illustrating not only the data connection process, but also the diligence with which you support learning and sense making of that data for communities and for the network as a whole. And I think that's totally incredible and inspiring as well. And now I'm really keen to pull in here, Kathy, your perspective as a local member of the Ontario, the Opportunity Youth Network. What, from your perspective, have been both the benefits and also some of the challenges in terms of monitoring outcomes and impact at the local level, and any advice you would offer, because there are local projects here on the call around how to navigate that?
Hey, well, it's so great to be here. I want to thank you, Sylvia and Monique, for inviting me. Fun fact about me is I am French Canadian in background on my mother and father's side, and Nova Scotia Scottish on my father's side. So I feel real happy to be working with Canadians today. So I've been asked to talk about how we use data to identify progress and also gaps, because we use it to kind of chunk out the work and see where the next manageable intervention might make a difference. So I'm going to share with you kind of our basic approaches and then kind of tell you a little story of how we used it through our evolution. So one set of data we use is really obvious. It's like public data that you can get for free, and it's already kind of analyzed. Like for high school, we use the dropout and graduation rates, which are kept at both the state and local level. They're disaggregated a lot of different ways, including race and program income. So those can be very useful. They can be a little lagging. So sometimes in special programs, if we're evaluating, we look at leading indicators like maybe attendance, chronic absenteeism, which is now publicly kept in Massachusetts, which is great. For a population like Opportunity Youth that spans a large age, and I think it's even larger in Canada, there's no one institution to keep data on them other than the Census Bureau. So we use that data. For that, you probably need to hire a researcher or have a researcher to analyze it because it's specific. We're lucky to have Joe McLaughlin, our research director, who does a lot of that stuff for us, as well as other projects. Longitudinal studies. One of the big challenges is we really want to know what happens to youth next. We really want to track them all the way to successful adulthood, right, in a sustaining career, but there's nobody that's keeping that data set. So sometimes you have to piece together secondary results with post-secondary results and to see like what's happening. And that requires a researcher too, and probably some relationship built across the agencies that you're trying to track the young people through, and probably MOUs. So those are three basic ones. We like to use qualitative data. Stakeholder perspective often tell us things going on that we would miss otherwise, and that could be youth, students, parents, teachers, service providers, workforce professionals, just anybody who's relevant to the question you're asking, but always the youth. And finally, we do this kind of homegrown program census thing where we actually count seats of a certain type of service that maps to the need of a certain population. And we try to compare the size of the population to the number of seats to see if there's a gap. So those are our methods. We started working on this actually before Aspen with the Youth Transitions Funders Group. We started a collective impact project before they called it collective impact and got together 40 different stakeholders from the public schools to state agencies, local CBOs. And we looked at a lot of data together for a couple of years before we even made our plan. And it took a while to sift through. We worked with Northeastern University, and Joe was there at that time, Joe McLaughlin. So he worked with us, and they really had to sift through the public school data because they didn't keep graduation rates back then. And dropout rates weren't so well tended to, so weren't necessarily accurate. You know, we heard 8 and 9% were the rates, but it just felt like bigger than that. So they were able to sift through and tell us when you look longitudinally across all 4 years of high school, it's really more like 1 in 3 are leaving, and that's a crisis, right? And then 2,000 students a year dropping out, and that's accumulating in the community. So you'd have several thousand young people school age living in the community. And that's a powerful case-making statement that we got to address this. So we also did a lot of qualitative data and came up with our recommendations for change and published it all at a big event. I really, love Monique touching on this, that sharing your data, whether it's for case making, success in public events, letting the press know, is a great thing to do because that's how you're going to build momentum and expand the consensus that you've built in your 40-person group to maybe another 200-person actors and so on. So one of our big recommendations, because of the number of dropouts, was outreach to dropouts. So at the PIC, we wanted to jumpstart activity among the partners. So that was our first act, and I credit Neil Sullivan, our executive director, for thinking of this. So we hired 2 former dropouts who had gone on to complete college, and they reached out to dropouts, and nobody thought this was going to work. And we did this as an action research project. So we kept careful data on how many, who they were, why they left, and shared it with our collaborative and others regularly. And it was cool because we had so many that were interested in coming back, as you can see from the numbers in blue and orange. Blue is interested, orange is enrolled in a new school, that it really made people pay attention. And the Boston Public Schools at that point invited us in 2009 to co-manage a facility that would be a re-engagement center, part of public schools, part PIC. And they went and started doing their own research, deep dive into data on off-track youth, and they introduced several interventions to address them. Credit recovery, amping up the alt ed, bringing in city year to coach students with attendance challenges in over 20 schools. So, it really got the momentum going. And over time, we did see the rates decrease. These are the dropout rates. And both numbers and rates have decreased by half. Pause to, just make Monique's point that we know with COVID that we're going to see those rates go back up again. So it's bittersweet to look at these. And disaggregated by race, we still see everybody improving, but still that stubborn and persistent equity gap for Black and Latino youth. Graduation rates went up. And yeah, we track by gender as well. So the next thing we turned to was thinking about college. And this is a different overlapping group of actors got together around the question of what's happening to Boston Public School graduates who are mostly Black and Latino, low income when they go to college. A lot of them go to college. We were proud of that. But so that's where we got together and did that longitudinal approach. People kind of went to the community college, went to all the colleges and the National Clearinghouse and the BPS, got the MOUs and started tracking the 6-year college graduation rate of BPS graduates and convening the colleges and other actors in the space, getting some nonprofits to coach young people in the first years of college. And we really saw that graduation rate respond. This is the rate over the entire graduating population went from 25 to 38%. And of those enrolled in college, it went from 39% to 52%. So I think coming into the Aspen work, we had a sense that this approach could work. If you don't solve everything right away. So when it came to working with Aspen, this is census data. We looked at a lot of things. We looked at race ethnic data and found high disconnection rates among Black and Latinos so that they make up the majority of our OY in Boston, not unusual. We looked at educational attainment and we saw that, really surprising to us, most of our OY in Boston had a high school credential. And a lot of people almost didn't believe our data. They're like, no, there's got to be more dropouts. But, we thought about it. We've been working on the dropout issue for a while. We've been seeing those rates go down. Maybe it's having an effect at the population level. Maybe it's because 20 to 24 is a bigger span and, there's just more years in that cohort. So it's a bigger group. But whatever, we thought could be our focus. And we added the program census data to that. So we saw not only is it a bigger group on the right, but also there are fewer program seats. Again, making sense because OY, 18 to 24-year-olds are kind of caught between the youth and adult systems. The adult systems have told us they don't really want to see them till they're 25. So we just see that borne out in this data. So next we turn to our youth leaders, which Aspen does truly center and gave us funding to pay our team of 6 who went out and interviewed maybe about 250 of their peers and gave us the recommendations, which was outreach workers, one-stop connection center, life coaches, etc. And we were lucky enough to get a grant to do an intervention. So the one we selected, working with the youth and the adults at our table, was a connection center that was going to kind of try out the re-engagement center model for graduates. Like if we reach out to them, do a career plan with them and try to get them into their training program, college, or a job of choice, could we make some progress? And the short of it is we made some progress, but we decided as a collaborative, we wouldn't run that center ourselves anymore. And luckily, one of our partners is running it, an initiative called Launch, providing services to young people living in public housing of that age. So that's a lot. And yet Aspen is challenging us again this summer to think about scale. All right, do you have any shovel-ready pathways to scale? And we had to think about that because there's pros and cons to any pathway you choose because nothing's perfect in our system. We're just beginning this work, honestly. Another piece of advice is stay in it for the long haul because it takes a while. So we did the program census thing again, and we looked at where young people were going, college and job training after high school. And we saw that really there's a lot more going on at the college in terms of usage, even though we're intrigued and we want to use training programs as more of a pathway through the Launch project. that for scaling, we thought we would use Bunker Hill Community College because we had 3 factors in that. This data that so many young people go there, and they're, low-income people of color. That population is really struggling over there. But the college has been a leader in terms of the college completion work in changing its policies to be more supportive, less punitive, more social supports over there. And they have a great project where they're listening to their young men of color tell them how they should change their institution to center it around them. So we said, we think this is a place to double down if we're talking about scale. So we have a few proposals out there at this point to try to see if we can get more coaching and get more specific career coaching, because the next transition is into the job market, and somebody's got to be paying attention to that, or that data won't look so good and those students won't get the chances that they deserve. So our opportunity youth numbers have gone down over the years. We're not sure if it's the work we're doing or if that trend is just happening, the hot labor market that we had. But again, we're going to see changes in that, and we'll have to figure out how we manage that. Probably set new goals will be our approach. So the last thing is advice would be it's worth paying for good research or hiring your own researcher. I suggest using multiple methods to learn more of the nuances. And I think that is probably good for now. So I'll turn it back to Sylvia.
Kathy, thank you so much. I think one of the things I'm certainly taking away from your presentation in particular is how you've done such a great job using data to both build commitment across different stakeholder partners, and then also how you've been very intentional about segmenting like bites, right? Clear bites that give you a deep dive, and then chunking those specific bites together into a more compelling long-term kind of journey of success. So it's fabulous. I'm so excited. I'm watching all these questions pop in. So I want to just maybe ask one more question of Monique, and use this, folks, as an opportunity, if you haven't posted a question, to go ahead and do that, because we do want to make sure we've got time for those as well. And we'll go there right after this. Monique, so tell me, we were talking a bit online, and you were talking about how you have deepened your own work in terms of creating a uses of data framework that you use nationally, but also locally. I'm not sure. So maybe you can tell us a wee bit about that to kind of bring the conversation to a close and open it up to questions.
Yeah, it connects that local perspective Kathy just shared so richly, in addition to Justin's fulsome overview of evaluation and learning. So we did put together this data use framework that has several categories to it. Very, very quickly, what I will say to connect the dots across what you've heard so far today. First and foremost, we are supporting communities locally and then nationally to use data to communicate the vision. So articulate the commitment, articulate the vision of the work, build commitment towards a shared vision for connecting the community's youth to education and employment pathways and advancing equitable outcomes. That's the first piece. It's just, how does data communicate a community-wide vision that all people can galvanize around? The second part of the framework is case making. Kathy spoke so well to this. So that is using data to communicate with funders, with policymakers, media, general public, and other stakeholders to articulate the need to support advancing outcomes for opportunity youth. And as you can imagine, that case making and the segmenting approach that Kathy has used can help you do that for secondary outcomes, post-secondary outcomes, career outcomes, but also different populations and different types of needs. The third part of our framework is understanding youth and their needs. So this goes back to that internal learning and thinking about how the collaborative itself can do continuous learning that drives strategy over time. Using data to understand who opportunity youth are and to ensure effective engagement and support. So you understand your populations and you're refining your pathways to meet the needs based on who your opportunity youth are, because we know they evolve over time, as Kathy reminded us. The next piece is that continuous improvement. Data used to assess, improve, and target the collaborative partners to support opportunity youth outcomes and services. The next part of the framework is holding partners accountable, partnership accountability. So using data to help partners own their specific contributions to the greater collaborative agenda. And then the final piece is assessing partnership health. Never forget how important it is to always be thinking about the individual health of the partnerships and how together they aggregate into a healthy collaborative. So essentially the data is used to make sure that the collaborative's infrastructure and capacity, that includes everything from communications and channels to the decision-making processes that you have in place, that they work across the greater group and are functioning in equitable and inclusive ways, so that at the same time you're sharing power. So I just thought that might be a helpful way to think about the different pieces that you've heard and how to bring them together into a broader framework that helps you think about community-wide outcomes that are tied to the health of your collaborative approach.
Wow. Is that a resource you could share?
Absolutely.
Oh,
Absolutely.
good. Because then we will make sure to include it in the post-event links for everyone. Because I know I'm madly jotting down all these pieces. And it's just such a blessing, A, that you all offered your time and have been so open and honest about the work so far. But it's also for us here who have just launched a similar communities building youth futures focus on ensuring youth success in Canada, that we have the benefit of your wisdom and experience to guide our way. So thank you all. And now I'm going to call on Duncan, because I know, Duncan, you've been following the chat box, and I've seen a couple of these really juicy questions. So over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Sylvia. Our first question comes from David, and they ask, it's being said that there will be around $100 billion for workforce development in the proposed infrastructure bill. What would be the best investments to target for impacting opportunity youth?
Yeah, I have some thoughts on this. I'll get us started. I'll just say, especially because I had a conversation about this earlier today, there's skills training. Kathy talked so well about this. There is, for us, we've been doing a lot of advocacy around post-secondary outcomes. So a lot of the work that Kathy walked through and how they're thinking about improving post-secondary outcomes for the populations we care about, that is really important. When we look at who was recession-proof, who was still able to work during COVID, it was young adults and adults with degrees. So that's a big part of what we're advocating for. We also will be remiss if we don't remember stabilization supports when we're talking about opportunity youth. It's not enough to have post-secondary pathways. It's also important to be able to support the wraparound and stabilization needs of our youth and young adults. And then finally, I would just add this in as we're thinking about training, we cannot forget about the technological revolution. So it's not just that we're preparing for the future of work, but 25 years from now, how will young people today be competitive in that labor market? AI, machine learning, the whole sort of technological revolution, I would add to how we should be thinking about skills training today. Kathy, I know you probably have a lot to add on this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you kind of said a lot there, but I think having seen, our kind of census map there, we definitely could agree with more high quality job training programs, more apprenticeships for young adults, with a real encouragement for young adults to take part in them. Because I think we get more older adults accessing those pathways and, transitioning in and through them much more easily. So I think we need pre-apprenticeship programs as well. I don't think subsidized jobs for young adults is a bad idea, because we need just work. In the early going, it may not be sustainable, but I think subsidized employment, I think that with ERA, what was nice about it is they took the opportunity youth lens, and it wasn't just summer jobs for teenagers. They went up to age 24, which I thought was great. I think we could go even higher with some subsidized jobs. And definitely, yeah, the post-secondary, anything that can be done to kind of support young people through post-secondary would be helpful. I'm not sure what is. Is it like the coaching like we do? Is it college bridging like NYEC? That's a national advocacy group for this, for OY, has in their policy recommendations, but I think it's definitely part of the package.
Anything you would add to that, Justin?
I think that's spot on. I agree with it needing to be holistic, and it's got to come from a place of equity. So there's an overlaying value. We have to direct resources to help those who need it most, and really not maintain the status quo, right? So that disposition, I think, needs to come with any dollars.
Beautiful. Thanks. What's next?
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you. Our next question comes from Joanne, and they ask, with increased national and international focus on racial equity, who or where are the communities, states, regions, or countries that can be looked to as examples of having measurable impact on systems regarding racial equity? And it's about opportunity youth, but also more broadly.
Yeah, I'll get started on this one as well. We have Boston with us. I think Boston is a really, really great example that has done this work with a commitment to racial equity. Kathy has she talked about this in her presentation. It was part of why, when I was approached by Tamarack, I thought of Boston. And I will say, not just even how they've targeted different systems, but also how they have used culturally responsive practices to target those systems. When they launched their re-engagement for secondary completion, they used former dropouts. They used young people who looked like the young people that they wanted to bring back into the system to go out to recruit their peers. You can't be more culturally responsive. You can't have a more culturally responsive practice than ensuring that someone who speaks your language, lives in your community, but also walked in your shoes is now inviting you to return to a system that's prepared to meet your needs. So how they have approached it, their whole focus on youth engagement and using young people to source the data, to engage their peers, and even now the post-secondary work that they're doing. She talked about boys and men of color and working with professors and young men in the post-secondary system. So I would say Boston is a really rich example of those practices that get centered and how they are able to achieve system changes. I would also add Philadelphia to the list and South King County, Seattle to the list of communities that lead with culturally responsive practices that inform system change. Kathy,
Anything in mind for Kathy or Justin?
I would just say we have a long way to go and we're just starting. That's what it feels like to live in Boston. And I would like to say the names of the two young men who reached out to dropouts, Emmanuel Allen and Marvin Moore, because it was quite a body of work and they deserve a lot of credit. And Emmanuel Allen, Manny as we call him, is now the director of the Reengagement Center, working for the BPS, and we still partner and we're still doing it.
What a great story. Justin, what would you add?
I would add, give me 2 weeks because we're almost finished wrapping up our next round of national data analyses. So it's a really good question. I'm with Kathy. I think there are a lot of bright spots around the country, and there are individual institutions and sets of institutions and partners doing really strong work in that space. But it's hard for me at this stage to endorse a particular community as in its entirety.
Well, I would certainly invite you when that data is all ready. I know that we have a very keen audience who would probably love to see kind of the high level and get a look at those details as well when you can share them.
Great.
Duncan, what else do we have?
Wonderful. Our next question comes from Ryan, and they ask, in regards to the self-assessments that were discussed, would it be possible to share those self-assessments? And also, who in the organizations complete them? Are there multiple people in each organization or an individual?
Yeah, thanks, Duncan. I can take that. So Monique, I'd look to you to tell us whether those can be shared. I'm sure they're floating around there in the ether in some way, shape, or form through all the reports that Equal Measure has written over the last several years. In terms of who completes them, it's one assessment per collective, and it is the backbone staff typically that complete it. But it's a pretty long assessment, and we do encourage folks to use the completion of the assessment as an opportunity to bring partners together and to reflect on the work and what's going on across the community, both in the collaborative and at the system level. So I think the best, if you will, the most accurate assessments are completed by groups of partners, and several folks have told us that process in and of itself has been really illuminating for them. But we don't require one or more people in particular to complete that, as long as they feel good about the data, we feel good about the data.
How about Kathy, Monique, anything you would add around that collaborative health piece? Nope.
Just, it is kind of cool to do it. We did the data for impact, the data capacity assessment with our collaborative, and it took a while, but it was really worthwhile, and it led us to think that we want to have a conversation about goal setting, and we're going to start that next month as a collaborative. And For the other one, since it was longer, we kind of did the two backbones plus a couple of our staff. So there were 4 of us and all different perspectives. One was millennial, so very, very our critical edge. So nice checker balance to us, proud, older conveners. So I think it probably came out okay in the end.
Really does highlight the importance of understanding and working with data and building that capacity locally, right? As an important skill set and part of the curriculum. Duncan, I think we have time for one more. What do you got?
Yeah, we'll try to sneak in one last question. It comes from Melissa, and they ask, any idea of how many of the opportunity youth would be registered and or voting?
Yeah, I did see that question come in. We don't have that number. We work with a couple of partners who this is literally what they do, the civic activation and participation. So while we support and foster that, that's not directly tied into what we're supporting or data that we track. But I would say, just thinking about our national partners, and I would have to give credit specifically to Opportunity Youth United, who are all former Opportunity Youth who have written an entire policy playbook and have very specific advocacy objectives for themselves and for their peers in order to promote greater equity for Opportunity Youth. Their big drive, their big push was voter registration for this past election in the US. And even right now in real time, they are on the ground. One of our colleagues, Jamil Alexander, was just on the ground in Georgia doing some organizing, some voter registration and trying to, for those of you outside of the US, Georgia is a place that got flipped in the last election and voted in a way that it hadn't traditionally. And it just meant, for all intents and purposes, just sort of greater equity and more inclusion in terms of where it landed. And so now there are real questions there structurally and from a political perspective about what's going to happen. So while I can't say here's the number of young people registered to vote, what I can say is that as part of that Opportunity Youth United movement, they are on the ground in places right now registering their peers so that both in between national elections and for local elections, young people's voices, but most especially Opportunity Youth, are on the ballot and become part of the questions the community is thinking about in terms of who should we be electing that's holding this Opportunity Youth agenda in their consciousness as they think about leadership at the community level.
Wow, I can't believe our hour is over. Like, it's just flown by, and there's so many. I'm watching even more juicy resources people are posting in the chat and great questions, that we still haven't had a chance to get to. We promise we will share all of these. And if you folks want to take a skim through, if there's other pieces you want to add, we will make sure that that's part of the archive. You got a comment there, Money?
The last question, I just wanted to say, you talked about that, I just have to say, there's real learning around the capacity that collaboratives develop over time to collect the data. We've been doing this for 9 years, and I love Kathy talking about this was a process for us. And so as a leader of a national network, thinking about how you really do support the muscle building, because it's a new muscle and a new way of collecting the data, using the data, and having that data inform strategy and continuous learning, how that muscle really over time adapt to the needs of the collaborative in OY. I would just say for locally to keep that in mind, that really is a process. It's a long-term process, and certainly nationally as you're aggregating impact, that also is a muscle that builds over time. So to be patient with yourself and kind to yourself while you're also moving those pieces forward is important.
Wow, that's probably the advice that speaks to heart around this journey and why it's so important, and not to let perfection be the enemy of the good here. We got to dive in and keep going, and you've given us big permission to do that. And thank you, all 3 of you, for being so generous and clear about this journey you've been on. I can't imagine anyone leaving this call feeling anything but inspired and hopeful. So thank you all very much. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Duncan, because I think you've got a couple of technical things to wrap us up.